that I'll inform you later about the link to our fan page. And also this webinar is being live streamed via our Facebook page, TERA. Thank you. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn over to Professor Paul Nation. Professor Paul Nation is Emeritus Professor in Applied Linguistics at the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies at the Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand. His specialist interests are the teaching and learning of vocabulary and learning teaching methodology. So now, Professor Paul, please.
Let me unmute, let me share. Oops, here we go. Right, and we're going to, from beginning. Bingo, okay. So, am I loud and clear to everybody? Give me a wave if you are, if I am.
Perfect, yes, you're perfect now.
Okay, good. Well, the topic that I'm talking about today is one that has interested me for a long time, and I'm almost finished writing the 3rd edition of my book, Learning Vocabulary in Another Language, and it should go off to the publisher at the end of this month. And I've actually been free from the writing of that book for about a week, and I've been coming back to look at a question which has started to interest me. And that question is, do we need more research? And it seems like a bit of a strange question. And I think it is a question which is, it's not a, how would you say, it's like a cheeky question. It's a question where I know, of course, we need more research. But I think there's also arguments that we actually don't need a lot more research. And the reason why I think that there's a lot of research that we don't need is that I think that people learn because certain things happen in their brain. And certain activities make these things happen. Certain learning conditions occur. And I think that we can look at any learning activity, and extensive reading is a learning activity. I think we should be able to look at any learning activity and say, what are the conditions that occur in this activity which make it work? And that's like saying, what are the principles of learning that we know about which make learning occur or help learning occur in this particular activity? And I think that now after, let me think, the principles of learning are probably well over 100 years or more old, probably much older than that. But there's been a lot of research on principles of learning, like the importance of repetition, the importance of retrieval, the importance of spacing, the importance of paying attention to what you want to learn, the importance of thoughtfully and deeply processing what you want to learn. I think there are very well-established principles. And these principles apply to learning through extensive reading. They apply to language learning. And I think they apply even more widely. They apply to learning almost anything that you want to learn. If you want to learn somebody's name, if you want to learn how to drive a car, if you want to learn how to be a better person, these all will be subject to the same basic principles of learning. And the reason why I asked the question, do we need more research, is I think that if you showed me a piece of research, and you showed me what the treatments were in that piece of research, and what the measurements of success or the measurements of learning were in that piece of research, I could tell you what the results would be before you did the piece of research. So if you said, I'm going to compare learning from extensive reading with learning from word cards, and The people learning from word cards or flashcards are not going to do any reading. They're only going to learn from flashcards. And the people doing extensive reading are not going to do any flashcard learning. And at the end of the experiment, I'm going to measure vocabulary knowledge. So I'm going to give them a test where they have a list of words and they have to recall the meaning of the words in their first language. I can tell you what the result of that experiment will be already. And that's not just because I've read a lot of experiments, but simply because there are principles of learning which are at work here. And we know what those principles are. And we know which, we're quite a long way towards knowing the relative strength of those principles and the relative importance of those principles. And I think then if you show me a piece of research where you say, here's the treatment, here are the measures, I reckon I can tell you what the result will be. And the reason for thinking about that is that when I was writing the third edition of my book, Learning Vocabulary in Another Language, I had to read about probably 600 or more different articles, because in the 10 years or more since the second edition, there's been a lot of research on vocabulary. And I looked back over that research, having read it and thought about it and written about it in the book, and I thought, which pieces of research tell me something new that I didn't know before? Which pieces of research were surprising for me? Which pieces of research gave me something that I thought, wow, I never knew that? And it turned out to be a rather small group of studies which showed me things that I didn't know before. And so that's why I asked that rather cheeky question of, do we need more research? And in one way, the answer is no, but in another way, the answer is, of course, we need research, because we need to know that the things we think are true are in fact true. And there are always some discoveries that we don't really expect to find, but we do find. Now, let me see if I can get into the talk now. Okay. So what I plan to do then is to look at principles of learning and see how they apply to extensive reading. But the learning that I want you to have today is to look at these principles of learning and get the idea that you can apply these principles of learning to any other kind of activity and make some judgment about it. The value of having principles of learning is that some activities don't apply the principles or don't apply all the principles. And you can sometimes improve an activity by applying a principle to it. So learning doesn't occur through magic. Learning occurs because certain things happen, certain conditions which favor learning, they occur, and these help learning. So there's nothing really magic about it. It's things must happen in order for learning to take place. Now, I think there's about 6 really important principles. And the big problem I have here is that when I was working away on this morning, I wasn't working on this, I was working on the idea of principles and so on. I sort of changed my mind about how many principles there were. And I think there's probably, instead of being 6, there's probably really only 3. But never mind, we'll cover them and we'll see what happens. Okay, so let's start looking at these 6 principles. And so I think the 6 principles that I am most interested in, and the ones that I think are most applicable for us, the 4 strands. And this is a principle of curriculum planning and curriculum design. And this is looking at what sort of balance of activities do you need to have in a well-balanced language course. As I said earlier, I think the 4 strands applies not only to a language course, but to other kinds of learning as well, such as learning to drive a car, or learning how to operate certain machinery, or even learning certain subject matters at university, like learning to be an economist or learning to be a lawyer. I think these 4 strands apply, and these are the strands of learning through input, learning through output, deliberate study, and becoming fluent in what you already know. And I think you can apply these to a lot, but we'll come back to that. The second principle I have on my list is time on task. And time on task is really saying you really need, what you need to learn is what you need to work on. Now, that seems so obvious that it seems, is it worth saying? But it is worth saying, because if you want to learn how to use a language, then you have to use the language, and you can learn by using the language. And the more that you make of the language, the better you will become at using the language. So if you run an extensive reading course and you say, I'm going to get my learners to do lots of reading, you can have a very good expectation that the learners will become good at reading, because that's what you're doing, and that's where the focus of attention is. This can get rather subtle in the sense that when we do certain tasks, especially in the areas of vocabulary learning, we might actually be focusing on the form of the word, or we might be focusing on recalling the meaning of the word, or we might be focusing on the pronunciation of the word, or some aspect of a word. And whatever aspect we focus on, and if we focus on it enough, then that's likely to be what we will learn. The researcher who has done quite a lot of useful work on this is a man called Joe Barcroft, and Joe applies this, I sort of call it a focus principle, in the sense that we actually learn what we focus on, and if an activity makes us focus on certain things, then that's what we'll learn, but we probably won't learn the things that we don't focus on. A third principle, and this is really related to the second principle, is a principle of repetition. In order to learn something, it's highly unlikely that we will learn it through one meeting. We need several meetings with items, and we need to do something many times in order to really learn it or become good at doing it. And so I think that this principle of repetition is important, but there are many different kinds of repetition. There's repetition, which I call verbatim repetition, which is the same thing coming back again in exactly the same way. And then there's varied repetition. And we know that varied repetition is generally more effective than verbatim repetition. The fourth principle is more complicated than it seems, and this is the quality of processing. And that is, repetition helps learning. But there is a theory of learning called the levels of processing theory, which says the only thing that really matters in learning is the quality of the mental activity in the brain at the moment that learning takes place. And if the quality of mental activity in the brain is deep and thoughtful, then we will remember. And if the quality of mental activity in the brain is superficial, it's not deep, it's not thoughtful, then we won't retain what we learn. And I really like this theory of learning called the levels of processing theory. It's a little bit out of fashion now, but that's like me. I've rapidly become out of fashion as well. So I think it's quite in keeping that I hold to out of fashion theories. If you were a student in any one of my classes, there was something that you had to learn on the very first day of coming to class. And that is, if you want to succeed in this course, you have to show respect to old things. Now, for Thai people, that's no problem. That's part of Thai culture. But paying attention to old things means old research is often research which has very good messages and provides good information for us. Old teachers also are things which should be given respect, and that as well. So anyway, so the levels of processing theory said the really important thing in any learning is the quality of the mental activity in the brain at the moment of learning. For me, I think this is this has a very important message of saying learning occurs not tomorrow, not yesterday, learning occurs now. And so what's happening now is what's really important for learning. And there are many levels to quality of processing, and we'll come back and look at those. And then the fifth principle I have is a cost-benefit principle. And this largely comes from my interest in vocabulary. And that is a principle which simply says that at any time in a language course, we should be focusing on the things which are going to give us the greatest benefit for the cost of learning. Learning involves effort, learning involves work, and we want to make sure that our effort and work are going to bring good benefits for us. And so from the vocab perspective, this is related to frequency of occurrence, and I see that frequency of occurrence is a very useful way of working out the benefit of something for learning. And we're going to look and see how that applies to extensive reading. And then the sixth principle is the principle of autonomy. And the principle of autonomy says that in any learning endeavor, any classes, ultimately it's the learner who is responsible for learning. Because even though teachers do their best, it's really learners who are the ones who have to learn. And if we can get our learners to start to take responsibility for their own learning, then we have a chance then that learning will occur beyond the classroom, that learning will occur in the classroom as well, but then that learners are then independent of having to rely on teachers and others for learning to occur. And I think autonomy is very important. And a really important part of autonomy, I think, is understanding principles of learning. If we want to become autonomous learners, we need to know, what can I do to improve my learning? Why does learning occur? How can I help learning occur? And I think in this respect, learners and teachers have to be well informed about the principles of learning and how to apply those principles. So then, now let's have a look at each one of those principles, and we'll try and see how each principle applies to extensive reading. Okay, the 4 strands. Those who have heard me talk, those of you who have heard me talk before, you can go to sleep at this moment if you like, because this is a message that I usually give in all of my courses. The reason I like the principle of the 4 strands is because it provides an answer to most of the questions that teachers tend to ask about learning a language. So if a teacher asks me, how do you teach reading? The answer is very simple, the 4 strands. And that simply means that in order to teach reading, you have to make sure that the learners have opportunity for input, they have an opportunity to read, they have some opportunity for output, not a lot, because if it's a reading course, then you want most of the input-output to actually be input. Okay, but there should be given, some attention should be given to output. About a quarter of the course time should be on language-focused learning, deliberate learning. So when you do a reading course, you should spend some time studying reading strategies and vocab learning strategies to help reading and so on. And you should do some intensive reading as well. And then about a quarter of your course should involve fluency development. That is, doing speed reading and getting good at reading. And if you ask, how do you teach pronunciation? How do you teach spelling? How do you teach writing? How do you teach speaking? You can come back to the 4 strands and say, you've got to have opportunities for input, output, deliberate study, and becoming fluent. And if you have a good balance of those in your course, then you're setting up opportunities which will provide a good balance for learning to occur. So then a well-balanced reading course includes extensive reading, intensive reading, and development in reading speed, particularly with a speed reading course. And you can see then that my well-balanced reading course, the extensive reading would make up about half of the course. That would be the strands of input-output, which you can see as being one big strand making up about a half the time. And in the reading course, it should be mainly input. So about half of your reading course should really be extensive reading, about half of the time. And then about a quarter of your reading course should include intensive reading, perhaps the learning of reading strategies, so strategies for reading, perhaps learning about the principles of learning, so you know the importance of retrieval and the importance of repetition and so on to help learning. And then about a quarter of your reading course should involve reading speed, and that is doing a speed reading course or reading very easy extensive readers so that you get good at reading and can read at a speed which is closer to 250 words per minute. Instead of reading at a speed which is around about 100 words per minute or less. And so a well-balanced reading course then would have a good balance of the 4 strands in the course with the focus largely on input rather than output. So extensive reading then involves silently reading a lot of material that is at the right level for you. And this is typical of meaning-focused input. There shouldn't be a lot of new material. The new material should be rather small, and then you should have lots and lots of input. So you can see then that there are some sort of principles coming here from other principles, and that is silently reading a lot of material is then bringing in the time on task principle. So extensive reading should apply that principle of time on task. Intensive reading can support extensive reading, and it's important then that even things like learning the pronunciation of words, I think, is part of intensive reading, because we need to have good, stable spoken representations of words in order to have to be able to help vocabulary enter into the long-term memory and also to help develop fluency. And then easy extensive reading is a part of a well-balanced course to assist fluency development. So that's the 4 strands. From the point of view of extensive reading, to get text at the right level, we need about 98, learners need to know about 98% of the running words in a text. And that means that in any text they read, there should be only 1 or 2 words per 100 which are unfamiliar to them. Now that seems like not so many words, but if you think about it, then 98% coverage, if a page has 300 words on a page, then that will be somewhere around 6 unknown words on a page. And on the next page, it's likely to be a different 6 words. And you keep adding up the words per page. That's still quite a lot of vocabulary, which is unknown. So even though 98% seems quite high, it's not really that high. It still provides an opportunity for a lot of unknown words to be met, but it still makes the load of reading still reasonably heavy. Some people want to argue for 95% coverage like that, where it's 5 unknown words in every 100. But when you think about that as being 15 unknown words on every page and 15 unknown words, different words on the next page, that's starting to get beyond common sense. So that's really important there. Meaning-focused input in extensive reading. Book reports can be seen as meaning-focused output, sorry, and it would be a good kind of meaning-focused output because The book reports are based on the reading that learners have done, and so this provides opportunity for repetition and spaced repetition and for more thoughtful processing and varied repetition of the material that's been met before. Language-focused learning in an extensive reading course, I think, should involve flashcard learning. I think that the deliberate, rote learning. People like to use the term rote learning as if it's a swear word, as a bad word, and say, oh, that's rote learning, it's not good. Rote learning is great, as long as it applies to only a small part of the course and it's focusing on the kinds of knowledge that learners can get easily through rote learning. And so there's hundreds of pieces of research on the value of rote learning for learning vocabulary. And they all show it's highly effective. And as one of our PhD students showed a few years ago, Stephen Krashen is wrong. Rote learning does result in implicit knowledge as well as explicit knowledge. And implicit knowledge is knowledge that you can access without having to consciously seek that piece of knowledge, but you can access it very speedily. And that can occur immediately as you do rote learning. There are now 2 or 3 pieces of research which support the research by Irina Elgort that I mentioned. So Steve Krashen is quite wrong about this. He argued that if you do rote learning of vocabulary or rote learning of grammar, then that rote learning won't be available for normal language use. I think he's probably correct when it comes to grammar, but he's certainly not correct when it comes to vocabulary. Another aspect of language-focused learning is strategy development. There are useful strategies that learners can use. A dictionary use is a good strategy, and I'm all in favor of electronic dictionaries. I'm very much in favor of electronic glossing of text with hyperlinks. These all add to the learning. And then the 4th strand of a well-balanced extensive reading program is fluency development. I was just rereading this morning, the piece of research by Begler, Hunt, and Kite, which looked at the effect of extensive reading on reading fluency. And over the period of, I think it was about 8 months, where they got learners doing pleasure reading, and they compared that with learners who were doing intensive reading. And they found that learners who did the most extensive reading made the greatest improvement in reading fluency. But an additional finding was that the learners who read the most graded readers made even greater improvements in reading fluency. Because if you want to get fluent in doing something, you don't become fluent by reading difficult material. You become fluent by working with material which is very easy for you to read. And so that study had the very interesting finding of, yep, if you want to get good at reading quickly, then do a lot of reading quickly, and do a lot of reading quickly of easy material, because you can read easy material more quickly than you can read difficult material. And there's now plenty of research on speed reading courses to show that having a dedicated speed reading course, which occupies only about or less than 10 minutes per session, and you only need to do probably 2 or 3 sessions per week, but a total of about 20 reading passages. By doing that, you can increase your reading speed by at least 50%, and in some cases double your reading speed. So these are really important parts then of an extensive reading program. And if we apply the 4 strands principle to extensive reading, we can then see the sorts of things which should be in a speed reading course in order to get a balance of learning opportunities. So if you want to know, have I got a good speed reading course? Have I got a good extensive reading course or not? Then you can look at the 4 strands and say, yep, are the learners spending at least 50% of the time doing meaning-focused input reading? Are they spending about a quarter of the time doing easy extensive reading to develop their fluency? Have I got a speed reading course as part of my extensive reading course? And then am I doing a little bit of language focused learning, encouraging them to increase their vocabulary size by deliberate learning so that they then meet the same words again in their reading and then have a chance of getting repetition and strengthening that knowledge? And am I teaching learners strategies such as dictionary use, guessing from context, and so on, which will help them to get the most from their reading? Okay. The second principle, time on task. The time on task principle says that the more time you spend on using a skill, the better you will become at using it. And this is what I call a quantity principle. It's not saying the quality of the work you do. It's simply saying if you do a lot of work, if you work hard, then you will become good at doing something. So it's a very crude principle in some ways. It's a principle really just simply looking at quantity, but it's a principle that always works. In experimental research, for example, one of the really important variables that you need to control when you compare one treatment with another treatment is to make sure that the learners in the two treatments are spending about the same amount of time on the learning. Because if they're not, it's generally the case that the learners who spend the most time on the learning will get the better results. And quite a few studies, when they are redone, if you control for time on task and they didn't control for it in the original study, you sometimes find that the result is different as a result of controlling for time on task. Because time on task is a very crude, blunt quantity principle, but it's a principle which always seems to work. If you want to get good at reading, do lots of reading. If you want to get good at writing, do lots of writing. If you want to get good at speaking, then find plenty of opportunities to do speaking. So extensive reading really applies the time on task principle very well, because a good extensive reading course involves lots and lots of extensive reading. And one of the things about extensive reading is that it's really a quantity-based activity. Learners should do lots of extensive reading. Reading one book in a semester is not really extensive reading. Reading lots of books in a semester is extensive reading. And that's why it's called extensive reading, because it involves lots of reading. So it's a very good application of the time on task principle. So just under 1/4 of the time in a general language course should involve extensive reading. I actually think it's a bit more than that, because if you include fluency development in that as well, then you'd have to add another 1/8 to that, and to say about 3/16 of the time in a language course should involve extensive reading for input and extensive reading for fluency development. The third principle is the principle of repetition. If you need to learn something, you've got to keep coming back to it. And it's really important that repetition is spaced. That is, that all the repetition is not done within a very short period of time, but is spread over a reasonably long period of time. If we look at vocabulary learning, there are really only two things that matter for vocabulary learning, and they are repetition and quality of processing. If you want to learn words, you've got to keep coming back to them. And if you want to learn words, you've got to process them deeply and thoughtfully. The greater the number of meetings with a word, the greater the chance of it being learned. We can also apply this to the reading skill. If you do lots of reading, then you are repeating the kind of skills that you need for reading. That is, you're recognizing words from their written form, you're attaching these written forms to their meaning, Okay, you can go to a smaller level and looking at sound spelling correspondences. If you do, the more and more reading you do, the more you can draw on sound spelling correspondences, that the letter P generally equals P, and so on. All of those sorts of things can be seen as being a kind of repetition. At the beginning and intermediate proficiency levels, extensive reading involves vocab-controlled material, and this creates opportunities to meet the same words again in different books. The value of graded reading schemes having different levels is that within a level, you have roughly the same kind of vocabulary occurring. And so you then have a chance of meeting that same vocabulary again when you read different books. There's a very big problem here, and the problem is called Zipf's law. And Zipf's law is a description of the distribution of vocabulary in a text. And Zipf's law says, if we look at any kind of text, about half of the different words in that text will occur only once. The other half will be of varying frequency, with a small number being very frequent and then an increasing larger number becoming less frequent. But half of the words in any text will only occur once. And even if you join a lot of texts together, you still get Zipf's law working. Even if you write an English course book, people do frequency analyses of course books for learning English. About half the words in an English course book will occur only once. And that's simply because that's the nature of language. Now, to some degree, but only to a small degree, having a graded reading scheme for extensive reading helps fight Zipf's law. And one of the vocabulary teachers' big issues is how do you deal with Zipf's law and make sure that the large amount of vocabulary which occurs only once and which is important for the learners has a chance of being learned. And that's also why deliberate learning is quite important when we come to vocabulary learning, because we can't always rely on the repetition of vocabulary in text to give us enough repetitions for learning. The holy grail question, the thing that people seek but can never find when it comes to repetition, is how many repetitions do we need in order for learning to occur? The minimum seems to be somewhere around about 6 or 7 or 8, somewhere about that. That's a minimum. But in fact, some words require many, many repetitions, more than 20 or 30. In one of Rob Waring's pieces of research, they found that some of the most frequent words, which occurred over 20 or 30 times, were actually not well known by the learners, because there are many other factors besides repetition which affect the learning of vocabulary. But in general, the more often something is repeated, the more often the greater the chance of it being learned. And so the value of extensive reading, which uses graded readers and controlled vocabulary levels, is that it increases the opportunity for repetition. Quality of processing. Yeah, so the two things which are really important for vocab learning is repetition and quality of processing. And here we have an attempt to try and measure the levels of quality of processing. The most superficial level is a level of noticing, and that is you just give attention to something. Now, you might remember that when I was talking about the time on task principle, I talked about we learn what we focus on. What we give attention to is what we learn. And if we don't give attention to something, then the likelihood of learning it is much less. So the noticing level is simply a level of saying, well, here's a new word. Looking up a word in a dictionary is at the level of noticing, because we notice a word and we notice its meaning. But that's not very deep or thoughtful processing, but it's a very important part of learning, a very important step in learning. The next deepest level of quality of processing is called retrieval. And retrieval can only occur when we've already met something before and we have a chance to recall or retrieve what we have met before. And retrieval, from the point of view of vocabulary, strengthens the link between the word form and the word meaning. When we see the word form in reading, we have to think, what does that mean? And we try to retrieve what we learned about that word from previous meetings. So retrieval, and particularly spaced retrieval, is very important for learning. Now, there's another kind of retrieval, and that's at level 3 in the quality of processing, and that's varied meeting and varied use. And that means we retrieve, but we retrieve under different circumstances from how we met the word before. So if we meet a word and then we meet it again in a piece of reading, it's likely to occur either in a different form, say with a different inflection, or with different collocations, or in a different grammar within the sentence. There are many ways in which a word can occur again in ways which are different from how it previously occurred. And I've called these varied meetings and varied use. I've used other terms such as creative use and generative use and so on like that, but I found that those terms were either already used or they tended to not give the message clearly enough. So I've now finally settled upon talking about varied meetings and varied use. And so when we meet something which is different from the way we met it before, the learning is much better. And then we have the deepest level, which is the level of elaboration. This is like a level of analysis, perhaps. If we look at a word and break it into parts, then that's a kind of elaboration. If we see a word and we relate it to some visual image of the word or some instance of use of the word, but a visual instance of use of the word, then that's a kind of elaboration. If we apply some memory tricks and techniques to the word, like the keyword technique, that's a kind of elaboration. And elaboration is really something which adds new information and new associations to the word that we're meeting. I think that when we actually use language for genuine communication, that can result in the kind of elaboration. If we're reading a story, an extensive reading, and we're following the story and we're involved in the story, then that can provide a kind of elaboration for us. Now, dictionary use involves noticing. The main kind of learning condition in extensive reading is varied meetings, or we could call it varied retrieval, because we know from studies of graded readers and from ordinary books that whenever a word occurs again, it's likely to occur in a different kind of context. If you do a concordance of a book, that is, you pick some words and you look at all of the contexts that that word occurs in, you'll find that it isn't the same context occurring again and again and again. It's a different kind of context. And so most of the learning of vocabulary through extensive reading occurs, I think, through varied meeting and varied use, largely varied meeting. There's a little bit of elaboration which occurs in extensive reading if learners are morphologically aware of word parts and word families and word stems and so on. And if when learners meet a word, they say, oh, that's connected to another word I already know. And if they make that deliberate connection, that would be a form of elaboration. I think it's really important that learners get some lessons and some activities which relate to the prefixes and suffixes and the stems of words, because I think that this can result in a very useful independent kind of learning, which can help through the knowledge of word parts. But by far, most of the learning, I think, of vocabulary and extensive reading occurs through varied meetings, and that's how we expect vocab to grow. Okay, cost benefit. The cost benefit principle says that learners should learn what is most useful for them. From a vocabulary perspective, this means learning the 3,000 high frequency words before moving on to other vocabulary. Fortunately, the designers of graded reading schemes know about high frequency vocabulary. The grandfather of graded reading, or probably the great grandfather now of graded reading, was Michael West. And Michael West developed one of the first major lists of high frequency words. So he knew all about cost benefit analysis, and the idea of cost benefit analysis really comes from Michael West's work in the 1920s and the 1930s. We should show respect to the old professors, the old researchers, and so Michael West is a good person to have some respect for. Graded reading schemes use the high frequency vocabulary of English, and they involve several frequency-based levels within that high frequency list. In the last few years, we've tried to extend graded reading schemes to go beyond the first 3,000 words of English. And if you look on my website, you will find examples of what I call mid-frequency readers, which are graded readers which are based on the 4,000, 6,000, and 8,000 word level. Some volunteers have actually adapted texts to go up there. I did several of them, but there's some other very diligent volunteers who've also used the range program, or better still, the Ant Word Profiler program, to help adapt texts which are out of copyright so that they can be read at the 4,000 word level, the 6,000 word level, or the 8,000 word level. And so that's why learners can continue to get the greatest benefit for the cost of learning. Okay, autonomy. The autonomy principle says that learners should take control of their own learning and should understand how to learn. I think that part of understanding how to learn involves understanding the principles of learning. And so, in a way, I'm trying to practice what I preach today. I really want you to come away from this knowing that there are some very important principles of learning, such as getting a balance of learning opportunities. What else, folks? Can you do retrieval? Can you say, now, what was the second principle? Time on task? Yes, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, it's really important that if you want to learn something, you spend a lot of time doing it. What about the next principle? Repetition? Yep, exactly right. Good. Yeah, repetition. And then the fourth principle?
Quality of processing.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's good. Yep. So I'm encouraging you to do some retrieval, because I know that retrieval helps learning. And then the fifth principle, cost benefit. Yep, that's right. Cost benefit. We should be working with stuff which is at the right level, so that the new material that the learners are coming into contact with is what is going to give them the greatest benefit, in the sense that they'll be able to meet that vocabulary again and again and again. So autonomous learners who are doing extensive reading should know how to choose the right level of graded reader for themselves. That is, they should have a rule of thumb where they look at the page and say, how many unknown words on this page? Is that too many, or that? If they're truly autonomous and well-informed, they might go off and give themselves a little test. using one of the vocabulary levels test and find out how well they know words from a certain frequency level and then make their choice based on that. They should look up some words that they can't guess from context. And so learners should have the idea that looking up words is good. You shouldn't overdo it, because if you're overdoing it, you've chose a book which is too difficult for you. If you're doing lots of lookup, then you've probably chosen a graded reader which is too far ahead of you at the present time. And learners should therefore understand the 6 principles and how to apply them to extensive reading. I think that when writers write course books, they should actually teach principles within those course books. I don't know of any course book which teaches learners about the importance of spaced repetition, about the importance of spending time on task, about the importance of doing thoughtful processing by, increasing the quality of processing through retrieval and so on. And it seems to me that course books should actually make sure that this important learning of principles is actually part of the language course. I started to design a few little inserts that you could put in a language course to teach learners these principles. And it wasn't very hard to do, but I think it's a really important thing. And I'll come to that. Some of you may have heard me tell this story before, but for me, it really had an important lesson. A few years ago, I was working outside and I slipped over and I damaged my shoulder a little bit. And I thought, oh, yeah, it's a bit stiff. I'll see if I can get someone to give me some help with it. So I went to a physiotherapist, and the physiotherapist gave me some really, good movement and some exercises to do. And I got talking to him. Then I realized he asked me, well, where do you come from? And I told him the name of my hometown. And he said, oh, I know somebody from there. And he mentioned the name of my nephew. And I said, oh, yeah, he's my nephew. Oh, okay. And this physiotherapist used to work in the post office in telecom with my nephew, and they were troubleshooters. And when technology started changing and the internet started dominating communications, people started getting made redundant and so on. Now, this physiotherapist, he was working in telecom, and he said, when we were in telecom, we had to do some courses and, to teach us the new technology and things like that. But in one of the courses, the teachers not only taught us the subject, but the teacher says, here's how you can learn some of the things that I've been teaching you. And so the teacher explained how to do some learning. Now, the teacher's explanation actually wasn't that great. It was okay, but it was simply things like write the things you need to learn on Post-it notes and stick them in your bathroom so that when you go to the toilet, you can see them. Stick them on the refrigerator and do things like that. And it wasn't terribly, how would you say, profound advice. And you, after today, could have given much better advice to the learners. But he did these things, and he said, when I was at secondary school, I wasn't very good at learning. I thought I was dumb. And when I did these courses as part of my job, I found out I'm not dumb. I can learn well. And so when he got made redundant, he went and did a degree, and he did a degree in physiotherapy. And now he's one of the top physiotherapists in New Zealand. And I see that one of the major causes for that is that during his classes, his teacher not only taught him the subject, but taught him how to learn. And learning how to learn actually changed his life, because he then found that things that he thought were difficult were no longer difficult when you knew how to go about learning them. So it seems to me that language teachers should learn from this as well. Learning a language is not magic. Learning a language occurs because certain conditions occur, And these conditions put certain principles into practice. And teachers should know these principles, but even more importantly, learners should know these principles too. And so the principle of autonomy says learners should be in control of their learning. They should know how to learn. And one of the aspects of knowing how to learn is to know the principles of learning. Now, I think that these 6 principles apply to many kinds of learning. The questions that I'm interested at the moment, as I mentioned earlier on, is, do the principle explain the results of research? And that's something that over the next 2 or 3 months I'm working on. Each morning I pick an article which I think is particularly important, a piece of research, and I say, do the principles of learning explain the results of this research? And if they don't, then do I need to then add a new principle to the list and so on? So far, I've added 1 new principle. And that principle is sort of already there, but so far the principle I've added is the principle, what I call it, appropriate processing. And that means if you want to learn to do a certain thing, then you must do a similar thing in your learning. It's really a variation of the time on task principle. If you want to be able to read quickly, then you should be reading material which allows you to read quickly and so on. There's more to it than that, but really it's making sure that the kind of activities you're doing in the classroom make sense in what the learners need to use the language for. And as I mentioned, there's the question of, do we need more research, and are there other principles and so on? I would think in about a month or so from now, I'll have a much clearer idea of what I think the principles are. Going by where I'm up to so far, I think the number of principles will probably reduce. They'll probably reduce into 3 major kinds of principles. One, the principle of doing appropriate work, that is learning which matches the kind of use that you want to make of the language or of the skill, the principle of repetition, and the principle of quality of processing. And I think those 3 are probably the 3 basic principles. But we can see, though, that extensive reading is actually quite a useful activity because it does meet many of the principles of learning. It provides the opportunity for getting balance into a course. A lot of language learners lack the opportunity to really make use of the language receptively or productively, and extensive reading provides receptive use of the language. The principle of repetition is applied, the principle of cost benefit, the principle of quality of process, quality of processing at the level of varied repetition or varied retrieval occurs. And we have the chance for learners to be autonomous learners through taking control of their own extensive reading in terms of the choice of books and whether they accompany their learning with some deliberate learning and so on. Okay, references. If you want to know more about the principles of learning, then John McAllister and I have written a book called Language Curriculum Design. That's now in its 2nd edition, and there's a whole chapter there on principles of learning. The book that I've written, which I feel is the most useful one for teachers, I've written quite a few books, but the ones that I think is by far the most useful book for teachers is What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? You can get this book electronically through Amazon, and it's not very expensive. One of the conditions of getting the publisher to publish it was that the publisher didn't charge a lot of money for people to buy the book. And I think it's about $15 US. And then fairly recently, Rob Waring and I worked on a book called Teaching Extensive Reading in Another Language. And this was a very extensive survey of the research on extensive reading, because there's been a lot of research on extensive reading, but not a lot of people have tried to bring that research together. Okay, I think that's about all I have to say. I'm happy to deal with questions. The questions can relate to the talk, but I'm happy to answer other questions as well.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul. I think it's very interesting. Personally, I'm impressed with the word learning, how to learn quite a lot. But let's get started with a few questions from our participants. Just a reminder, please be sure you type the questions and the question in your control panels. Let me kind of share the screen to have everyone see kind of very similar questions from the participants. I believe both of them are from Thailand, right? Ajaniya Wan Sukraini and Risa Impressed. So question number one is about the recommendations for elementary level students, means kind of primary school students, for employing ER in English language courses, and
Okay.
about the text
Let me do
coverage.
one at a time, because I'm old and I can only deal with one question at a time. If people ask me two questions, I can only remember the second one.
Okay.
Okay. With elementary proficiency level, I think it's worth finding out what level of vocabulary learners know. There are tests on my website, tests designed by other people, I should say, and these are vocabulary levels tests. There's one designed by Web Balance, Sasau Web and Balance, and there's another test by Stuart McLean and Brendan Kramer. And these test words at the 1,000 level, the 2,000 level, the 3,000 level, and you don't have to give learners the whole test. You can just take the level that you're interested in. And I would be giving the first 1,000 level of a vocabulary levels test to my students if I had students at elementary level, to see how many of the first 1,000 words they know. And if it's only a very small number, then you really need to be getting the reading texts from the Foundations Reading Library, because those books assume knowledge of less than 100 words of English. So you can get some books then for some graded readers which are at a really low level that most very elementary students should at least be able to begin to read. It's likely that you'll have a range of proficiency in your classroom, no matter how well people try to assign learners to levels and so on like that. You always end up with a range of levels of proficiency. And so you want to make sure then that you have a range of graded readers which are working at good levels of proficiency. Now, the other thing is we really lack tests which test knowledge of the first 1,000 words at different levels within the first 1,000 words. And I think it would be quite useful then for us to develop vocabulary tests which test, say, the first 200 or 300 words of English, the first 500 words of English, and so on like that. And that's something that we lack. It's not a very difficult lack to make up with, but it's a way of making sure that we really know what vocabulary our learners know. But there are many books at the elementary level, and so I'd be looking around for those and getting hold of those. If you look on the website of Victoria University, Linguistics and Applied Language Studies, there could be a text called Stories from Around the World, and you might be able to use those at the elementary level. Certainly on my web resources pages, there's a speed reading course at the 500 word level. And if your learners did know 500 words, that would also be a good course for them to do. Okay, Kun Narisa, 98% text coverage. Does this number apply to all levels, or are there different levels? I think it applies to all levels. There are two ways of looking at the 98% coverage. One way is to say, what does research show? And there's some research to show that the greater the coverage, the better the comprehension. And that's a fairly consistent finding amongst the small number of pieces of research on this. But the other way of looking at it is the common sense level. And the common sense level is to say 2% unknown, 2 words per 100, 300 words a page, 6 unknown words per page.
Yes.
Is that reasonable or unreasonable? And it seems to me that when you start getting to 10 or 15 unknown words per page, that's unreasonable. It no longer is reading, it becomes torture. It becomes something you really don't enjoy doing. And so I think that that coverage figure applies. One of the big problems with reading unsimplified texts is that even when you know quite a few words, say if you know around about 5,000 words of English, if you're reading a novel about 100,000 words long, there'll be well over 1,000 words, 1,000 different words which are outside your level. And those words will only be occurring once or twice. There'll be a few topic-related words, maybe less than 20, which occur reasonably often. But there'll be lots and lots of words which occur only once or twice, which are well outside your level, well over 1,000. And so those mid-frequency readers that I mentioned, the greatest effect of the mid-frequency readers is simply getting rid of a lot of those words that occur only once and that won't occur again, and that really just make the burden so heavy with this, there's something new in almost every 5 or 6 lines, just too heavy. Okay. Difficulties, the lack of meaning in the definition.
I think this is kind of the comments about the concern how to do that in Thailand. I mean, it's difficult to select the right level for primary students or secondary school students. That's the comment number 1.
Yeah, the thing I would say about that is it's possible using rote learning to learn a fairly large number of words, such as 100 or 200 words, in a fairly short time. And by rote learning, I mean you either use a flashcard program, and the words you're learning are English words, and the meaning is given in Thai or whatever the first language of the students are, or you make your own little word cards out of a piece of paper, or you buy some cards if you're rich. I tend to cut up a piece of paper and then write the word on one side and then the meaning in my first language on the other. These are very efficient. So one way would be to really begin or to get ready for extensive reading simply by getting the learners to do rote learning over a short period of time of 100 or 200 words. And you'd make sure that those words were words which were the beginning of the graded readers. So words at the level of level 1 of graded reader series. So that would be my first thing, because otherwise you've got the barrier of lack of vocabulary to overcome in order to get reading to occur. So I'd be going at that as a way to do it fast. Okay, among the 4 strands, which will help more in the vocabulary development, and in which strands does extensive reading take place largely? Okay. The answer is that you need a balance of the 4 strands for vocabulary development. In some ways, deliberate learning will give you faster results. So that's a language-focused learning strand. But you need to be able to make use of the vocabulary you know. And so that strand by itself is definitely not enough. Which strand does extensive reading take place largely? Well, 2/3 of extensive reading should be in the meaning-focused input strand. And 1/3 of extensive reading should be in the fluency strand. So that means that 2/3 of the time in your extensive reading course should be reading material which is at the right level for the learners, so that there are only 2% or less unknown words. And 1/3 of the time should be spent reading material where there is 100% known words, but reading it faster than they would normally read it. And so I think an extensive reading program then needs to have a fluency strand as well as a meaning focused input strand. Okay, that's good. Any more?
Right. Yeah, we have got quite a lot of questions, and these three are very interesting.
No, you should choose the easy ones and throw away the difficult ones. Okay.
Yeah, I'm starting from the easy ones to the most challenging one.
Then we'll try and run out of time before we get to the difficult ones. Okay. Given the challenges of this pandemic, what advice would you offer teachers wanting to teach extensive reading in a primarily virtual environment? Oh, that's a difficult one. I thought you said
should I move to the end?
No,
later.
We'll have a go at doing it. The nature of extensive reading is that it should be largely an individual activity. So in some ways, the pandemic is favoring extensive reading, because you can't get the classes where teachers are standing up the front and dominating the time. You then have the opportunity to do your learning independently and at your own speed and at your own time and so on. So in a way, you could regard the pandemic as favoring extensive reading, because it's favoring individualized, autonomous, self-monitored learning. So from that point of view, the pandemic is quite good. In New Zealand, we have a few lockdowns to avoid transmission of COVID. I actually quite enjoy lockdowns, but because I get enormous amounts of work done. I'm uninterrupted and I can go on and do my work. And in a way, if we can somehow encourage learners to do extensive reading during this time, that seems to me ideally suited to the conditions, but the problem is motivating them and monitoring them to do it. I tend to have a negative view of teaching. I think that teachers teach far too much. I see the teacher as having about 5 jobs. The first job of the teacher is to plan, and that is to make sure that the learners have a balanced course, that is to apply the 4 strands, to make sure that the teachers are applying the cost-benefit principle to plan so that the most useful material is dealt with before the next most useful material, and so on. And the second job of the teacher is to organize, and that is to get the learners to do the work, to organize them into group work, to encourage them to work independently, and to do sorts of things. The third major job of the teacher is to train, and that is to teach the learners how to do learning by themselves, to teach them language learning strategies, to teach them to know the principles of learning, and so on. The fourth most important job of the teacher is to test, and that is to see if the learners are making progress, to see where they are in their knowledge, and testing helps with planning as well. And the fifth job of the teacher, and this is in order of importance, is to actually teach. And if you think about the 4 strands, meaning-focused input doesn't really require the teacher to teach. Meaning-focused output doesn't require the teacher to teach. Language-focused learning, some of language-focused learning, such as intensive reading and perhaps training in principles, requires the teacher to teach. Fluency development doesn't require the teacher to teach. It requires the teacher to organize activities like speed reading, 4-3-2, 10-minute writing, and things like that. And so the actual teaching that teachers should do is really only a small part of the language-focused learning strand. And so the advantage of being in a pandemic like COVID is that teachers are to some degree discouraged from teaching and then have to give more emphasis to their roles of planners and organizers and trainers and things like that. And for me, that seems to me a real good thing. Okay, would you give some suggestions for evaluating students' performance in extensive reading? Or no? My suggestion is that I think that this should be done on an individual basis, I guess, and that is, are the learners really doing extensive reading? And the teacher needs to find some way that the learners, of checking that the learners are really doing extensive reading. Now, Paul Goldberg's X-Reading program does this very effectively through various, I think very well thought out measures. But it seems to me that I would evaluate students' performance by the amount that they read, that they truly read and comprehend. I wouldn't be too concerned, are they moving quickly through levels? That's good, but I don't think it's as important as that they are really reading and comprehending and at the level which is most suitable for them. So I would tend to be looking at evaluation on an engagement and a quantity basis, I guess. Okay. Do you have any suggestions as to how we can increase the number of autonomous language learners in our EFL classes? Well, I can tell you a story about that. When in my office, when I was teaching, I had a little bottle on the table, and I'd found this bottle underneath an old house that had been pulled down. It was a beautifully shaped little bottle. I think it must have been an ink bottle. And one day I happened to clean the bottle and rubbed it. And all of a sudden, out of the bottle came this big figure. And it said, "You have one wish. Whatever you wish for, you can have." And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. So I thought, well, I've got a friend who lives in the top of the South Island. Now, to go to the South Island, we either have to fly or we have to take a ferry and go across in the ferry. And I said, well, it would be really good if there was a bridge going from the bottom of the North Island to the South Island. And so I said to this spirit from the bottle, can you build a bridge from the bottom of the North Island to the top of the South Island? And the spirit said, well, it's okay for you to ask it, but I'm the one who has to do all the work. And that's a really hard and difficult job. Why don't you ask me something a bit easier? And so I said, okay, how do you increase the number of autonomous learners in our EFL classes? And then the spirit said, okay, how many lanes do you want on the bridge? 1 lane each way or 2 lanes each way? And the moral behind that story is it's really hard to get learners to become autonomous learners. But I think the starting point for doing it is to make sure that the learners understand the nature of learning and what's needed for learning. And what I'd probably do is to gradually teach them principles of learning and get them to report back on their experience with applying those principles of learning. For example, I'd teach them the principle of retrieval in saying, if you want to remember someone's name, how can you use retrieval to do that? Let's try it and see if it works. And so I do activities like that. When it comes to cost benefit, for example, one way would be to say, well, there's a program on Tom Cobb's website called the Frequency Program, or you can get the same program from my website, and you run a text through the Frequency Program and you see how some words are very common and some words only occur once. And so learners can then understand how there are useful words and not so useful words and things like that. So I would gradually introduce learners to the principles of learning, making sure that they apply these principles. And over the period of about a year or so, I'd cover the 5 or 6 principles, but getting them to experience them, to apply them, so that they can see that it is possible to take control of your own learning. And apply this not just to learning within the classroom, but to learning outside the classroom. Okay, that's question 6 done.
Right. I'll try to make it about, maybe there are about 12, I guess.
Okay. Should there be some sort of preparatory work before we do the speed reading drill? Should the idea of preparatory work be negated so as not to mitigate the effectiveness of the speed reading drill? There shouldn't be any preparatory work for speed reading. I think in the speed reading courses that you can find on my website, the learners should just do the speed reading. I think I know where this question comes from, because there are some speed reading courses which argue that learners can read at more than 1,000 words an hour or something like that. These are largely nonsense. And what happens when you look at what they want learners to do is that they study the book beforehand and find what's the topic, you know, and they do a lot of preparatory work. And then they say, now we can read at a speed of 1,000 words a minute. It's not physically possible to read at the speed of 1,000 words per minute and pay attention to all the major words that you need to pay attention to in a text. If you read at a speed beyond 300 words per minute, that's the upper limit of normal reading, then you are missing focusing on some of the important words in the text. And you are doing this because you already have previous knowledge about the text. So the speed reading courses that we want learners to do to prepare for extensive reading is for them to reach a speed of around about 250 to 300 words per minute, where they pay attention to just about all of the content words and quite a few of the function words in the text. If you want a bit more about the theory of this, then you can look on my website, and there's an article called, I think it's called Reading Fluency, and it's published in a Thai journal called Pasar. And that explains some of the physical aspects of speed reading, such as fixation times and saccadic jumps and all of that, which show that there is actually a speed limit for normal reading. And it's normal reading that we want learners to deal with. Okay, do you have any recommendation for schools that don't have any graded readers? Yep, get them. Or subscribe to X Reading or do something like that. There's not really, you can try and substitute for it, but you're really making a lot of, you're creating a lot of work where that work could easily be overcome. I think other people like Rob Waring and Paul Goldberg can answer this question much better than I can. But one way that I would use would be simply, if you can get each learner to buy a graded reader that you recommend, and then use that as your library where learners exchange reading books with each other and so on, then that's what I would do. I can't recommend copying books which are in copyright, but somehow you need to get lots of graded reading material. May I know the sites or somewhere I can get research related to writing through reading? Ooh, no, I can't recommend anything about that I know of. Let me just think. Writing through reading. I don't know Spawn, so that doesn't, I can't help you there. Sorry, that's getting a bit outside of my knowledge.
All right, so let's move on to the next questions. Very interesting one again.
Oh, yep. I reread that paper this morning. This is Ploy, the Begler, Hunt and Kite paper. where they got learners to do pleasure reading and to see the effect on fluency. I think that might be the one you're referring to. This is fine as long as what the learners are reading are at the right, what the learners are reading is at the right level for them. One of the best examples of extensive reading that I've seen was in Tokyo, in Japan. And I'd heard about a man called Akio Furukawa, and he ran a private language school, and it was mainly catering for secondary school students who would come at about, I'm just trying to remember now, gosh, something like 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and then they'd do a 3-hour course. And Akio was a mathematician, and for a very terrible reason, I think, not terrible because of him, but terrible towards him, he decided that he was going to set up a language school where learners could choose simply to do extensive reading. So they would pay money, they would come for their 3-hour lesson, and either half of the lesson, an hour and a half, or all of the lesson would simply be sitting quietly, reading the book with the teacher doing no teaching. Now, if I gave that to you as a business model, you would say, oh, he's not going to make any money. Akio is doing very well indeed. I went to visit his school, and he said, "Oh, Mr." And one of his assistants was saying, "Yeah, Mr. Furukawa has classes in that building, and he's got, I think he owns this building here." And we're walking around Shinjuku in Tokyo, looking at all these buildings that Akio has a part of, because his students get really good results. And what he did was, the students simply sit down and they read quietly. And the teacher sits at the front, and the teacher does some work without interrupting the readers. Now, he said, now you watch this. So he said to the students, "Do you like doing this course?" "Yeah, we like it." Well, of course, they got to say that because the teacher's there, but I think they were being honest. And then he said, "Would you do this reading at home by yourself?" And they said no. There was 1 or 2 in the class who said yes, they do, but most of them said, "No, we don't have the time, we're too busy." Now, the fees for the course are reasonably high. The parents are very happy to pay the fees because the students in these courses get very good results on the entrance exams for universities. And that's what makes the Mr. Furukawa, I would say, a rich man, because he gets results. And yet the course was simply about reading. And some of the students were reading graded readers. Some were reading original literacy works. The whole classroom was just full of shelves with any sort of book that learners could choose to read. And many of them were original literary works or just ordinary novels or whatever. But whatever the learners wanted to read and they could manage, that's what they read. So I think it doesn't matter too much whether it's graded readers, original works or not. But what's important is that they have to be at the right level for the students. And some students have good enough proficiency to be able to read beyond the level of graded readers, and that's fine. If they're reading original literary works which are far too difficult, then that's not really extensive reading. Okay, now let's look at question 11. As far as I know, repetition could not really answer it because of memorization without comprehension. Do you have any suggestions to strategize the reading skills under repetition principles? Well, it's important in extensive reading that learners understand what they read. And I think that, and understanding what you read involves reading material which is at the right level. So I think that the definition of extensive reading that Rob and I arrived at, which I gave very early in this talk, was, reading lots of material, which is at the, independently reading lots of material silently, which is at the right level for you. That seems to contain all the things that you need for repetition. If learners are reading without comprehension, then they're not reading, and you've got to get to the bottom of what that problem is. And the problem is simply likely to be the texts are too difficult. So I wouldn't think about strategizing reading skills or anything like that. I just simply make sure that the learners are reading text at the right level. Okay, question 12. May I ask you, could it be that I could read anything that I'm in to do? Yeah, I think you could read anything as long as it's at the right level. I, for example, think that watching movies is good for language learning. I think watching television programs is good for language learning, as long as you're engaged and it is at a level in which you can comprehend the material you are dealing with. So I think that reading things which really interest you is important. And there's another reason why it's important besides engagement. And it's simply that if you read within a narrow area, and that's the area of your interest, and you stick to a very narrow topic, the vocabulary load becomes much less. You have about half the number of different words in texts which deal with a single topic than you do in texts which deal with lots of topics. So I think it's important then to follow the things you are interested in and to read in that area, and you will find the vocabulary load is much lighter. It won't have much effect on repetition. Narrow reading has a relatively small effect on repetition, mainly just for topic words, but it will reduce the number of different words that you meet very strikingly. Okay. Is that about it?
Thank you very much. I know I promised 12, but there are two more very interesting questions again, if you not mind. And we still have
that's
like
all right.
five more minutes, right?
Yeah.
But I think we should end at 14, right? Right.
I can't see 13 or 14 yet.
Let me show number 13 round.
Yeah, got it now. Okay.
Right.
Re-rote learning. You mentioned the benefits of rote learning. Are there more benefits in reciting grammar rules? No. I think that the learning of grammar is very different from the learning of vocabulary. And I think learning grammar rules doesn't really, I think Stephen Krashen is probably right about learning grammar rules, and that it allows you to monitor and to check things, but it doesn't really give you up. You can't use it when you're under time pressure and in normal language use. So for me, rote learning is really very useful for vocabulary, but I don't see the benefits in applying it for grammar learning. So they're not equally weighted. And I think that grammar learning is something which needs to occur more implicitly than explicitly. Okay, Dr. Bunyarit. Can dictionary be used while reading? Yep. Yeah. There's been some argument about dictionaries and extensive reading, but the research on this is very clear. The research shows that dictionary use helps vocabulary learning during extensive reading, and dictionary use helps comprehension during extensive reading. One of the principles that I'm sort of working on to add to the list, but I'm still unclear in my head about it, is that if you want to learn something, you should see it should be comprehensible and complete. Because there's some research on activities, particularly collocation activities, where the learners are saying which word goes with which word, and they give them a kind of test and see how that helps learning. It's actually not very effective in helping learning. It's much more effective for learning if you see the right answer and then you have a chance to retrieve the right answer. That's much more helpful for learning than trial and error. So with guessing from context, it's quite a good idea if you feel a little uncertain about your guess to check it by looking in a dictionary. Now, there's been a very useful meta-analysis of studies of glossing in learning vocabulary from reading. And glossing is where you can click on a word and get its meaning. And the meta-analysis shows very clearly that glossing helps vocabulary learning. So I'm all in favor of dictionary use. But as I said earlier, you have to make sure that if there's too much dictionary use, it's probably an indication that the material is not at the right level for the learner, and they should be choosing material which has a lower density of unknown words. Okay. Good. Have I covered everything now?
Yes, almost. I think we are doing good now. Thank you very much, Professor Paul. I think many of the questions are from Thai teachers in Thailand, and there's very good points about the grammar things that they kind of pay much attention than kind of other kinds of output activities. And things. So I think we learned a lot from today. So thank you very much again. And I think we covered most of the questions now. Right. And would you like to leave any other comments or issues?
No, I've had a quick look through the chat and I think I've covered most of the questions. That's good. It's very good to see you having a conference on extensive reading and providing the opportunity. I consider that the most important improvement that a teacher can make to a language course is to include extensive reading. If you want to make one change, which the research shows will have the greatest effect, that would be to have an extensive reading program. So I think you're doing exactly the right thing.
All right, so thank you very much again, Professor Paul. So we'd like to moving on to give everyone more information about extensive reading activities happening around the world and in Thailand. So before I wrap up, let me invite Professor Rob Waring, the member of the Executive Board of the Extensive Reading Foundation, to share us some information about the ERF. Professor Rob, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm just going to spend about 5 minutes or so just talking about some of the things that the ERF does. And I'm just showing you here the website for the ER Foundation. It is erfoundation.org. And I want to just show some of the things. So this is the homepage here, and we are showing here that we held a very large conference online last month, where we had over 750 registered people came, 110 sessions on extensive reading. And the Extensive Reading Foundation often holds these conferences, and you can see here some of the ones that we have done already. And next year, we're going to be holding the 6th Extensive Reading World Congress, which will be in Indonesia in August. So we're expecting several hundred people to turn up. And again, many more than 100 presentations only on extensive reading, nothing else except extensive reading. So please look at that. The Extensive Reading Foundation has a lot of affiliate organizations. These affiliate organizations are ones which are related to the main Extensive Reading Foundation. We have them in Korea, we have them in Japan, Middle East, and so on and so on. And we also have TERA, which is now forming, and various ones in Vietnam and so on. So we have affiliate organizations which we're helping, and that's what TERA is doing today. There's also information about what extensive reading is. There's a thing called the ER Toolkit, which will help you to set up a program, some tools that you can use. There is a guide to extensive reading, which is available in many, many languages, including Thai. So we have that guide for you to have a look. If you have any questions, please go there. We also have books on extensive reading and various other things, so please look at that. If you're interested in research and you want to learn something about extensive reading, we have a bibliography of research which you can search and have a look for over 600 different books or articles or pieces of research. That's very useful. The ER Foundation also hosts the Language Learner Literature Award. This is an award for the best extensive reading materials during the year. And you can see that this is the main page. And these are the various awards winners over the years. You can go and have a look here over the last many, many years that we've been doing this. The Extensive Reading Foundation also offers a grant, money for schools to set up an extensive reading program. This is very competitive. So you need to make an application to the ERF down here, where you can maybe get some money to promote extensive reading in your area. There's also resources about graded readers. Paul mentioned about these books, which are specifically written, specifically designed to build extensive reading skills and knowledge. There's a scale of extensive reading that talks about what is a low level, what is a high level of graded reading. And also, if you're interested, there's a link to my own website, which has a list of all the various graded readers which are available down here by the Extensive Reading Foundation level. So you can see that these books here go from early beginner to there. This series starts here and finishes there. But be careful, this level 1 starts at the 1500 headword level. This level 1 starts at this level. So please, when you're looking at graded readers, don't assume because it says level 1 that it's a beginner book. So be careful of that. The ER Foundation also has a list of the various graded readers which are available. There's a big long list here. Please click and go and have a look. We have information about mReader. mReader is an online quiz environment where you can assign your students to read some books. They read the book, they take the quiz online, and you can download the data to check that they've been reading and check that they've been understanding. This is the mReader system, and you can see that here. And there's an ERF placement test. There's also some free reading materials. A question that we had was about where can I get material? So there's a free graded readers website and link to another website the ERF has just made, plus a website called ER Central, which actually is my own website, which is completely free for materials. And these are the conferences that we hold. The last thing I want to show you is the ERF YouTube channel. Now, this is the ERF YouTube channel. Go to YouTube, type in extensive reading, and you can see here we have many, many, many different videos. These are some of the videos from the Extensive Reading Around the World conference, which we held last month. And there are, oops, sorry, I shouldn't play all, I should just show you them all. There are about 100 of them. This one here is one that I made, which is for absolute beginners.
And I'm going to be talking
today. Yeah, we don't want to stop that one. Okay, sorry. This is for absolute beginners, new to extensive reading. There are ones down here as well. And there's also some videos by Paul when he was not quite so intelligent and as handsome as he is today. So this is when he was a bit younger. There's lots and lots more here. Please go and have a look. There are many different playlists or different types of things you can learn about for extensive reading, and all the videos are here. One of the questions came up is, how do I do extensive reading during the, when I don't have materials? I answer this in a presentation that I gave that was called ER Without Money and Without Resources. Here we go. How do you do extensive reading with no money and few resources? So if you're looking to find out more information about extensive reading, the ER Foundation has lots of material for you to use. And also we have lots of information. So please check out the ER Foundation website and the YouTube channel for more information. We are hoping to associate very strongly with the Thailand Extensive Reading Association in the next few years. We hope that all of you or many of you can attend the 6th World Congress on Extensive Reading in Indonesia next year. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Rob. And I'd like to remind everyone again that this webinar is being recorded. So if you like to rewatch or repeatedly watch it again, you can visit our website. You can just search using the keyword Thailand Extensive Reading Association, or TERA, and you find us. And if you're in Thailand and you're not a member yet, you can register as a member. It's free now, but not too long for everyone to join us. And there are a few more events that maybe some of you who would like to talk to us in Thai. There's a teacher story webinar by Ajahn Nusara and Ajahn Thutipa in Thai in October. And there's another workshop. If you would really like to start kind of extensive reading program in your school, you may join us in a workshop by Professor Rob Waring. The details of these 2 events will be announced again later on our website, some other websites that you've seen later. All right, so